Shanghai's skyline glitters with the confidence of a civilization reborn. Belt and road infrastructure projects stretch across 3 continents. Xi Jinping speaks of national rejuvenation, of the China dream, of a country that has finally stood up after a century of kneeling. But beneath this triumphant narrative lives a ghost, a memory of humiliation so deep that it shapes every major decision the Chinese government makes today. To understand why a nuclear-armed superpower with the world's second-largest economy still defines itself by wounds inflicted nearly 2 centuries ago, we must return to the moment when the world's oldest continuous civilization was forced, at gunpoint, to become a drug market. In the year 1800, China stood as the center of the known world. The Qing dynasty controlled an empire larger than it had ever been, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia, from the Siberian border to Southeast Asia. This wasn't merely territorial dominance. The Chinese worldview itself placed China at the cosmic center, the Middle Kingdom, with all other nations existing in varying degrees of barbarism requiring civilization. The Canton system, established in 1757, reflected this psychology perfectly. Foreign trade was restricted to a single port, controlled entirely by Chinese merchants, operating under Chinese terms. The West could trade, but only as supplicants. European merchants lived in designated compounds, could not bring their wives, could not learn Chinese, and could conduct business only through approved intermediaries. This wasn't protectionism as we understand it today. This was the manifestation of a worldview in which China didn't have foreign relations. It had a tributary system where lesser nations acknowledged Chinese superiority in exchange for the privilege of trade. This wasn't arrogance without foundation. China produced what the world wanted: tea that had become essential to British culture, silk that draped European nobility, porcelain so fine that Europeans called it China itself. Britain, by contrast, produced woolens that Chinese consumers found inferior and unnecessary, timepieces that were curiosities rather than necessities. The result was a massive trade imbalance that threatened Britain's monetary system. British silver flowed steadily eastward, year after year, filling Chinese coffers while draining British reserves. Economic historians estimate that by the early 1800s, China commanded roughly 30% of global economic output. The Confucian bureaucracy, refined over millennia, administered this prosperity through an examination system that theoretically allowed any man of talent to rise through mastery of classical texts. The mandate of heaven legitimized imperial rule, creating a political theology that had sustained Chinese civilization through dynasty after dynasty, through the rise and fall of emperors, through invasions and rebellions. The system had worked for so long that it seemed eternal, natural, the only rational way to organize human society. But here's what the Qing court didn't fully grasp. While China perfected governance structures that had worked for centuries, Britain was undergoing a transformation that would rewrite the rules of power itself. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just creating factories and steam engines. It was creating a new kind of economic logic, a new relationship between commerce and violence, a new template for how empires would function in an age of mechanized production and global markets. And at the center of Britain's solution to its China problem stood a corporation that operated beyond the normal constraints of morality or law. The East India Company wasn't a business in the modern sense. It was a proto-state with its own army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, its own diplomatic corps, its own intelligence services, its own system of governance across vast territories. When it conquered Bengal in 1757, defeating the Nawab at the Battle of Plassey through a combination of military force and spectacular bribery, it gained control of the most fertile opium-growing regions in the world. Company administrators looked at opium and saw something remarkable: a commodity that created its own demand, that turned consumers into dependents, that generated profit margins unlike anything else in global commerce, that could reverse trade flows if deployed systematically enough. The mechanics were elegant in their cruelty. Opium would be cultivated in Bengal under company supervision, processed into smokable form, then shipped to China and sold by private merchants technically independent of the company, creating plausible deniability while generating enormous profits. Those profits would purchase Chinese tea, which would return to Britain, feeding both the British treasury through taxes and the company through monopoly markups. Chinese silver would flow to India, Indian opium would flow to China, Chinese tea would flow to Britain. It was triangular trade refined into narco-economics, a system designed to extract wealth from China by creating addiction on a scale unprecedented in human history. Adam Smith had published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, warning explicitly about the dangers of corporate monopolies capturing government policy for private gain. His warnings went largely unheeded. The East India Company had too many members of parliament on its payroll, too many retired company men in positions of influence, too much money flowing into too many important pockets. This was institutional capture perfected, the moment when a corporation's profit motive becomes indistinguishable from national interest, when the line between commerce and state policy dissolves entirely. What's remarkable from a behavioral economics perspective is how thoroughly the moral costs were externalized. The merchants who sold opium never saw the Chinese addicts losing their families, their livelihoods, their lives. The shareholders who profited from dividends never visited the opium dens spreading through Chinese cities. The politicians who protected the trade in parliament could tell themselves they were defending free commerce, British prosperity, the natural order of markets. This is moral licensing at civilizational scale. How the concept of civilization itself becomes a permission structure for exploitation. How being from an advanced society allows people to justify doing things they would find abhorrent if done to their own people. By the 1830s, the drug was flowing freely into China. Conservative estimates suggest 2 million Chinese were addicted, though the real number was likely far higher. Some contemporary observers placed it at 10 million or more. Opium dens proliferated in coastal cities, then spread inland along trade routes. Silver began flowing out of China for the first time in centuries, reversing the trade imbalance but devastating the Chinese economy. The silver drain caused deflation, making it harder for peasants to pay taxes, harder for the government to fund basic services. The social fabric was tearing. Families were destroyed as fathers, sons, brothers became addicts. Government officials, the Confucian scholars who were supposed to embody moral authority, were themselves often users. The military, which would soon be needed to defend against foreign aggression, was riddled with addiction. And the Qing emperor faced an impossible choice: allow the continued destruction of his people or confront the world's most powerful military empire. In 1838, Emperor Daowang appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner, tasked with ending the opium trade once and for all. Lin was that rare thing in any bureaucracy, a true believer in the system's stated values. A scholar who had risen through the examination system based purely on merit, he embodied Confucian principles of moral governance. He studied the opium problem meticulously, touring affected regions, interviewing addicts and their families, understanding its social and economic devastation. He approached the problem with the tools available to him, moral reasoning backed by imperial authority. Lin wrote a famous letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to shared human values. He pointed out that Britain prohibited opium in its own territory, that British law punished opium traffickers severely, that no nation would tolerate the poisoning of its people for foreign profit. He asked, with genuine puzzlement, how Britain could profit from selling to China what it forbade its own citizens from using. Surely, Lin reasoned, the British crown would stop this trade if the Queen truly understood its effects. Surely the Queen, a woman and a mother, would understand the suffering being inflicted on Chinese mothers and children. The letter reveals something profound about the collision of worldviews. Lin genuinely believed that moral authority would translate into political compliance, that if he explained the righteousness of his position clearly enough, appealing to universal human values that surely all civilized people shared, the British would cease their trafficking. This was the fallacy of composition, the assumption that what works within a Confucian bureaucratic system, where appeals to virtue and moral principle could move emperors and ministers, would work on external powers operating under completely different logics. Lin didn't understand that in the British system, commercial interests had captured government policy to a degree that would have been unthinkable in Confucian China. He didn't grasp that utilitarian ethics, which dominated British political philosophy, would weigh Chinese suffering against British prosperity and find the suffering acceptable. He didn't realize that Britain's relationship with its merchants wasn't like China's relationship with its merchants, that British power was increasingly commercial power, that attacking British commercial interests was attacking Britain itself. Lin ordered foreign merchants to surrender their opium stocks. When they hesitated, he blockaded them in their warehouses at Canton, cutting off food and water until they complied. Foreign merchants, caught between British demands to protect their cargo and Chinese demands to surrender it, eventually yielded. In June 1839, Lin oversaw the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium at Human, each chest containing roughly 60 kilograms of the drug. The opium was mixed with lime and salt, dissolved in trenches, then flushed into the sea. The operation took weeks. It was a moral stand of extraordinary courage. It was also a strategic miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. Lin had accurately assessed British behavior within the framework of Confucian ethics, where a righteous official protecting his people from poison should be celebrated by all civilized nations. He had failed to model it within the framework of industrial capitalism backed by naval supremacy. The British government didn't see a righteous official protecting his people. It saw destroyed property worth millions of pounds, violated contracts, humiliated merchants, and an opportunity to force open a market that had resisted all other pressures. Foreign Secretary Palmerston argued passionately that Britain had a right, even a duty, to defend its merchants and expand free trade. The utilitarian calculus was brutally simple. Chinese suffering weighed against British prosperity, and British prosperity won every time. The fact that the prosperity came from drug trafficking was reframed as a matter of contract law, property rights, and the freedom of commerce. By late 1839, British warships were sailing toward China. The First Opium War revealed a technological gap that shocked the Qing court to its foundations. British steam-powered warships could maneuver against wind and current, positioning themselves where sailing vessels couldn't follow. British artillery outranged anything China possessed, bombarding coastal fortifications from distances where Chinese cannon couldn't reply. British Marines carried rifles that could pick off defenders before Chinese matchlock muskets could even be aimed. Chinese war junks, which had dominated Asian waters for centuries, were obliterated by ships built in British dockyards. This wasn't a war in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration of what industrial military technology could do to a pre-industrial power. Canton fell. Ningbo fell. Shanghai fell. British forces controlled the Yangtze River, China's main commercial artery. By 1842, British ships threatened to cut the Grand Canal, which would have severed food supplies to Beijing and potentially triggered famine in the capital. The Qing court, facing a war it couldn't win and catastrophe it couldn't prevent, capitulated. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842 aboard a British warship, established a template that would define China's relationship with the West for the next century. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai, were open to British trade and residence. China agreed to pay 21 million silver dollars in indemnities. Compensation for the opium Lin had destroyed compensation for debts Chinese merchants supposedly owed British merchants. Compensation for the cost of Britain's military expedition to punish China for destroying opium that was illegal under Chinese law. Fixed tariffs meant China could no longer control its own trade policy or protect domestic industries. The abolition of the Canton system meant British merchants could now trade directly with Chinese merchants. Most favored nation clauses ensured that any concession granted to Britain would automatically extend to all Western powers, creating a ratchet effect where China's sovereignty could only decrease, never increase. This was the birth of the unequal treaty system, a framework of subordination formalized in diplomatic language, made to look like normal international relations while being anything but. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For the first time in recorded Chinese history, the Middle Kingdom had been decisively defeated by foreign barbarians. Not defeated in the sense of losing a border skirmish, which had happened before, but defeated so thoroughly that foreign powers could dictate terms in China's heartland. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the civilization at the center of the world with thousands of years of continuous history, with philosophy and governance systems refined over millennia, be forced to bow to island traders who had barely emerged from feudalism a few centuries ago? The mandate of heaven didn't provide categories for this kind of failure. If the emperor had lost the mandate, rebellion would restore the cosmic order. But this defeat suggested something more disturbing, that the entire civilizational framework might be inadequate. Confucian philosophy offered no framework for understanding technological superiority divorced from moral superiority. In Chinese thought, virtue and power were supposed to align. The righteous were supposed to prosper. The just were supposed to prevail. The shock created a kind of collective paralysis. A society that had perfected governance over millennia, suddenly confronting the possibility that everything it believed about itself, about its place in the world, about the nature of civilization itself, was wrong. But if the First Opium War was a shock, the Second Opium War was a deliberate humiliation designed to break Chinese resistance permanently. In 1856, Chinese officials boarded a ship called the Arrow, which was flying a British flag of questionable legitimacy. The ship was Chinese-owned, the registration had expired, but it had once been registered in Hong Kong. Chinese officials arrested Chinese crew members suspected of piracy. Britain used this incident as pretext for war, claiming the arrest violated British sovereignty. The justification was transparently thin, but it was enough. This time France joined as an ally, seeking its own commercial advantages and revenge for the execution of a French missionary. The combined Anglo-French force moved methodically up the coast, more experienced now, more certain of its military superiority. Guangzhou fell in 1857. The city was occupied for years. Tianjin fell in 1858, and a treaty was signed. But when China attempted to prevent foreign diplomats from entering Beijing in accordance with the treaty's terms, the foreign armies interpreted this as treaty violation and resumed their advance. In October 1860, British and French troops reached the Old Summer Palace, the Yuanminjiwan, a complex of gardens and buildings that had taken more than a century to create. It contained irreplaceable art from across Chinese history, historical records, architectural marvels blending Chinese and European styles in ways that represented centuries of cultural exchange. It was the emperor's private retreat, a symbol of imperial power and cultural refinement. Lord Elgin, the British commander, ordered it burned to the ground. The soldiers looted first, taking everything portable. Then they burned what remained. This wasn't military necessity. The palace had already been looted. Its treasures were already gone. The emperor had already fled. This was psychological warfare, the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage to break Chinese resistance, to demonstrate that nothing was sacred, that China's most treasured symbols could be destroyed with impunity. The fire burned for 3 days, visible for miles. The emperor fled to Manchuria, abandoning his capital to foreign occupation. And China signed the Convention of Peking, which went far beyond the earlier treaty. Opium was now legal throughout China. The poison that had sparked the conflict was now formally sanctioned. 11 more ports were opened, spreading foreign influence deeper into the interior. Foreign embassies would reside in Beijing itself, violating the sacred space of the imperial capital, forcing the emperor to treat foreign ambassadors as equals rather than tributaries. Christian missionaries gained the right to travel freely throughout China and proselytize anywhere, disrupting local social hierarchies and traditional belief systems. Kowloon, the territory opposite Hong Kong Island, was ceded to Britain. Extraterritoriality provisions meant foreign nationals were immune to Chinese law, even when committing crimes on Chinese soil. A British merchant who murdered a Chinese citizen would be tried in a British consular court, not a Chinese court, creating a visible system of legal inequality. Fixed tariffs were formalized and expanded, removing any remaining Chinese control over trade policy. And China would pay another massive indemnity to fund the war that had been waged against it, ensuring financial subordination would continue for decades. The unequal treaty system that emerged from these wars created a framework of subordination unlike anything in modern international relations. Extraterritoriality meant foreigners lived under their own laws while on Chinese territory. Fixed tariffs meant China couldn't protect its industries or raise revenue through customs duties. Most favored nation clauses created a ratchet where any concession to any power automatically extended to all powers. Foreign concessions in cities like Shanghai became territories within Chinese cities where Chinese law didn't apply, where Chinese police couldn't enter, where foreign powers effectively governed Chinese land. The international settlement in Shanghai, at its height, covered several square miles, and housed tens of thousands of foreigners living under foreign law in the heart of a Chinese city. The signs at parks, whether they actually said "no dogs" or Chinese, is disputed, but that Chinese people were excluded from certain parks in their own country is not disputed, became symbols of daily, visible humiliation. This wasn't colonial occupation in the traditional sense, where a foreign power took direct administrative control. This was something perhaps worse, a system where China retained nominal sovereignty while having almost none of its practical attributes. Robert Hart, a British official, ran China's Maritime Customs Service from 1863 until 1911, controlling a major source of Chinese government revenue. Foreign powers used their extraterritoriality rights to protect Chinese criminals who operated from foreign concessions. Foreign gunboats patrolled Chinese rivers, ready to intervene if their nationals' interests were threatened. And perhaps most galling, the system was legal. It was formalized in treaties that China had signed, under duress certainly, but signed nonetheless. This created a kind of psychological trap. If you accepted that treaties were binding, you accepted your own subordination. If you rejected the treaties, you rejected the basis of international law. Either way, China lost. The decades following the Opium Wars brought cascading disasters that seemed to validate the fear that China's entire civilizational framework had failed. The Taiping Rebellion erupted in 1850, led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and who sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a heavenly kingdom. The rebellion was partly triggered by the social dislocation the opium trade had caused, partly by the erosion of Confucian legitimacy the defeats had revealed, partly by millenarian religious fervor imported from Christian missionaries. It lasted 14 years and killed between 20 and 30 million people, depopulating entire provinces. The rebellion was finally suppressed, but only with foreign military assistance. The Qing dynasty now depended on foreign powers even to maintain control of its own territory. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 shocked the world in different ways. Japan, an Asian nation that had responded to Western pressure by rapidly modernizing, decisively defeated China, an Asian nation that had resisted modernization. Japanese forces used Western military organization, Western weapons, Western tactics. China lost control of Korea, its traditional tributary state. Taiwan was ceded to Japan. The indemnity was enormous, larger than the total Japanese government budget. And the psychological blow went even deeper than previous defeats. China had now been defeated by a former tributary state it had once considered inferior, a nation that had learned Chinese characters, adopted Confucian philosophy, sent tribute missions to Beijing. If Japan, by adopting Western technology and systems, could defeat China, then clearly China's resistance to Westernization was the problem. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was a last desperate attempt to expel foreign influence through popular mobilization. The Boxers were martial artists who believed their spiritual practices made them invulnerable to bullets. They attacked foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, foreign concessions, and ultimately besieged the foreign legations in Beijing for 55 days. An 8-nation alliance, Britain, France, United States, Japan, Russia, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, sent a relief expedition that crushed the rebellion and occupied Beijing. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed the largest indemnity yet, for 150 million taels of silver to be paid over 39 years with interest, totaling almost 1 billion taels. Chinese forts at coastal ports were destroyed. Foreign troops were stationed between Beijing and the coast to ensure future access. The indemnity was so large that it consumed a significant portion of Chinese government revenue for decades, preventing investment in infrastructure, education, military modernization, or anything else that might have allowed China to strengthen itself. The Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1911, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. What followed wasn't renewal but fragmentation. The Republic of China, established in 1912, had a president, but no real power. The warlord era saw regional military strongmen carving up Chinese territory, each controlling provinces, collecting taxes, maintaining private armies, and claiming legitimacy while the country bled. Some warlords were relatively enlightened, promoting education and modernization in their territories. Others were purely predatory, extracting everything they could. The central government in Beijing became a revolving door of weak presidents and prime ministers with no ability to project power beyond the capital. The Japanese invasion of 1937 brought atrocities that still shape Sino-Japanese relations today. The Nanjing Massacre saw Japanese troops systematically murdering hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over several weeks. Unit 731 conducted biological warfare experiments on Chinese subjects, testing plague, anthrax, and other diseases. The level of brutality was staggering even by the standards of World War II. And this was happening to a China still fragmented, still weak, still unable to defend itself effectively despite having endured a century of foreign aggression. The civil war between communists and nationalists, which had paused during the Japanese occupation under a fragile united front, resumed immediately after World War II ended. By 1949, after 4 more years of warfare, the communists had won. When Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen on October 1, 1949, and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, the statement was explicitly framed as the reversal of the Opium Wars legacy and everything that followed. The century of humiliation was over. China would never again kneel to foreign powers. The communist victory was presented not just as the triumph of one party over another, but as national liberation, as the moment when China finally regained the sovereignty it had lost in 1839. Economic statistics tell part of the story. China's share of global GDP had fallen from roughly 30% in 1800 to approximately 5% by 1950. But statistics can't capture the psychological weight of watching your civilization, the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, systematically dismantled. They can't capture what it means to be Chinese and grow up hearing stories from your grandparents about warlords, about Japanese soldiers, about famines and massacres and constant insecurity. This is what Chinese historians call the century of humiliation, and here's what's crucial to understand. The Communist Party didn't invent this narrative. The sense of humiliation was real, widely felt, embedded in lived experience across multiple generations. What the party did was weaponize it, channeling it into a political tool that serves multiple purposes. Mao's declaration that China had stood up became the founding myth of the new regime. Deng Xiaoping's famous instruction to hide capabilities and bide time was trauma-informed strategy. Never again be so weak that others can impose their will, but also don't provoke unnecessarily while still recovering strength. Build power quietly. Jiang Zemin's patriotic education campaign of 1991 institutionalized historical grievance, making century of humiliation education mandatory in schools across the country. Museums were built specifically to commemorate humiliation. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial, exhibitions on the Opium Wars, displays showing unequal treaties and foreign concessions. Textbooks were revised to ensure every Chinese citizen understood what had been done to their ancestors, who did it, and why it must never happen again. Xi Jinping's China Dream and Great Rejuvenation rhetoric draws a straight line from opium, war humiliation to contemporary policy. The message is clear. China was humiliated because it was weak. It was weak because it failed to modernize, failed to match Western industrial and military power, failed to recognize that the world had changed. The century of humiliation ended when the Communist Party restored strength and sovereignty. But the memory must be preserved because forgetting creates the conditions for new humiliation. Every major policy speech references this history. Every justification for assertive foreign policy points back to these wounds. This is national post-traumatic stress disorder, encoded into institutions, embedded in curricula, reinforced through museums and memorials and media. Psychologists who work with trauma survivors describe hypervigilance, an exaggerated sense of threat, difficulty distinguishing criticism from attack, a constant scanning for danger even in safe environments. At the national level, this manifests as policies that prioritize control and sovereignty above almost everything else. China's massive foreign exchange reserves, now over $3 trillion, aren't just economic prudence or the result of export surpluses. They're insurance against ever again being at the mercy of foreign financial systems, against ever facing the kind of silver drain that accompanied the opium trade, against ever needing to borrow from institutions that might impose conditions. The refusal to float the currency freely, the strict capital controls that prevent money from leaving the country without government permission, the state dominance of strategic industries. These are responses to a century when China had no monetary sovereignty, when foreign powers controlled Chinese customs and dictated tariff policy, when Chinese economic policy was written in London and enforced by gunboats. Consider Belt and Road, China's signature foreign policy initiative. On the surface, it's infrastructure development, ports in Sri Lanka, railways in Kenya, highways across Central Asia, power plants in Pakistan. The official narrative is mutual benefit, win-win cooperation, development partnerships that help poorer nations build infrastructure they couldn't otherwise afford. But look at it through the lens of historical memory, and different patterns emerge. China is creating exactly the kind of dependencies that were once imposed on it. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, built with Chinese loans, was handed over to Chinese control on a 99-year lease when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the debt. The parallel to Britain's 99-year lease on Hong Kong is unmistakable. Pakistan's Gwadar port gives China strategic access to the Indian Ocean it previously lacked. The terms of many Belt and Road loans mirror, sometimes exactly, the kinds of unequal arrangements China once endured: high interest rates, collateral requirements, provisions for control if debts aren't serviced. Across the developing world, Chinese infrastructure loans come with strings attached despite claims otherwise. Is this projection, the psychological mechanism where the abused unconsciously becomes the abuser, inflicting on others what was inflicted on them? Or is it a legitimate development model offering an alternative to Western institutions like the World Bank and IMF, which have their own histories of imposing conditions on borrowers? The answer probably depends on where you're standing, which itself reveals the challenge. China's behavior can be read simultaneously as reasonable sovereignty protection and as aggressive overreach, as defense against historical threats and as creation of new threats, as healing from trauma and as perpetuation of trauma on new victims. Hong Kong reveals the pattern most clearly. The territory was ceded to Britain in the Treaty of Nanking, the physical manifestation of Opium War humiliation, the constant reminder that foreign powers could seize Chinese territory and hold it indefinitely. When Britain agreed to return Hong Kong in 1997 under the one country, two systems formula, the handover was framed as erasing colonial shame, as rectifying a historical injustice. But the national security law imposed in 2020, which effectively ended Hong Kong's autonomy 50 years before the agreed transition period was supposed to end, wasn't just about control. It was about ensuring that no remnant of that humiliation could ever reemerge, that no foreign-influenced territory could exist within Chinese borders, that the wound could be fully closed regardless of international agreements or domestic Hong Kong sentiment. Taiwan, from Beijing's perspective, is the last piece of unfinished business from the century of humiliation. The island was ceded to Japan after the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. It returned to Chinese control in 1945 after Japan's defeat, but then became the refuge of the nationalist government when the communists won the Civil War. Taiwan is thus simultaneously lost territory from the weakness period and the final remnant of the Civil War that ended the century of humiliation. Reunification isn't negotiable because accepting permanent separation would mean accepting that a piece of China can be taken and held indefinitely, which is exactly what happened during the century of humiliation. The psychological stakes make compromise nearly impossible. The South China Sea claims, where China asserts sovereignty over island groups and waters that other nations also claim, can be read as rejecting historical weakness. During the century of humiliation, China couldn't even defend its coastline. Now it's asserting expansive maritime claims and building artificial islands to support them. Border tensions with India in the Himalayas, disputes over the Senkaku Islands with Japan, all can be understood as attempts to establish boundaries that weren't negotiated from a position of weakness to contest territorial arrangements made when China was vulnerable. The goal isn't necessarily to conquer new territory, but to ensure that no territorial arrangement made during China's weakness period remains unchallenged, that every border and maritime claim is established from a position of strength. The question that haunts contemporary geopolitics is whether China seeks equality or dominance. From Beijing's perspective, the answer is obvious and sincere. After a century of subordination, China is simply reclaiming its natural position as a great power, the position it held for most of recorded history before the Opium Wars. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't imperialism. It's mutually beneficial development that gives poorer nations options beyond Western institutions. State control of strategic industries isn't authoritarianism for its own sake. It's ensuring China never again falls behind technologically, never again faces an adversary with industrial superiority. Territorial assertions aren't aggression. They're correcting historical injustices, reclaiming what was lost when China was too weak to defend itself. The massive military buildup, including the world's largest navy by number of ships, isn't preparation for conquest. It's ensuring no foreign power can ever again impose terms through gunboat diplomacy. From Washington, Tokyo, Delhi, and other capitals, these same actions look very different. They see a rising power that can't distinguish between defensive and offensive behavior, between reasonable sovereignty protection and coercive dominance. They see Belt and Road creating dependencies that echo colonial relationships. They see territorial expansion cloaked in historical grievance. They see military buildup that threatens neighbors and disrupts regional balance. They see a country so traumatized by past weakness that it's becoming the very thing it claims to oppose. This is the security dilemma writ large across the most important geopolitical relationship of the 21st century. When China builds aircraft carriers to ensure no foreign power can blockade its coast, a reasonable defensive measure given historical experience, its neighbors see a blue water fleet that could blockade their coasts. When China accumulates foreign exchange reserves to prevent currency manipulation, others see economic leverage that could be weaponized in trade disputes. When China demands technology transfer as a condition for market access, reversing the forced opening of its own markets, it looks like coercion even if it's framed as sovereignty. Each side's defensive moves appear offensive to the other, creating an escalatory spiral that neither side may actually want, but both feel compelled to pursue. And underneath it all is the question of whether historical trauma justifies current behavior or merely explains it. History offers uncomfortable parallels. Post-World War I Germany experienced national humiliation through the Treaty of Versailles. Territory lost military restricted, to a token force enormous reparations that crippled the economy, a war guilt clause that assigned sole blame to Germany for a war that had complex causes. The humiliation fed resentment, which fed radicalization, which fed the rise of Nazism and ultimately World War II. Does this mean the Allies should have been more lenient at Versailles? Or does it mean that humiliation creates dangers regardless of whether that humiliation was justified by prior actions? China was genuinely victimized during the century of humiliation in ways Germany arguably was not after World War I. China didn't start aggressive wars that led to its defeat. It was attacked for trying to stop drug trafficking. Does that make China's current trajectory more justified or more concerning because the trauma runs deeper? Israel's founding narrative centers Holocaust trauma, the determination that Jews would never again be defenseless, that threats would be met preemptively, that survival takes absolute priority. This has led to policies that prioritize security above almost all other considerations, including international criticism. Supporters argue this is entirely justified given history. Critics argue it has enabled oppression of Palestinians and perpetuated conflict. The parallel to China is inexact but instructive. Historical trauma creates a psychological orientation that shapes policy in ways that may or may not be proportional to current threats that may serve legitimate security needs or exceed them, and observers will disagree based on their own positions and sympathies. Rwanda's post-genocide government justifies regional interventions in the Democratic Republic of Congo by pointing to the world's failure to stop the genocide in 1994, arguing that Rwanda must ensure its own security because international guarantees proved worthless. The trauma is absolutely real. 800,000 people murdered in 100 days. The policies it generates are contested: regional destabilization, support for rebel groups, interventions that critics call disguised resource extraction. When does trauma-informed policy become trauma-justified aggression? When does never again shift from defensive principle to offensive license? The domestic political uses of historical grievance complicate everything further. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't just acknowledge century of humiliation trauma. It actively cultivates it for political purposes. School curricula emphasize victimization in ways designed to generate anger alongside understanding. Museums are built not just to educate, but to provoke emotional responses. Rage at foreign powers, gratitude toward the party for ending the humiliation, determination to prevent its recurrence. When Western governments criticize human rights conditions in Xinjiang or Tibet, when they raise concerns about Hong Kong's autonomy or Taiwan's security, the party doesn't just reject the criticism on its merits. It reframes the criticism itself as neo-colonial interference, as the continuation of Opium War era exploitation by other means, as Western powers trying to keep China subordinate now that military and economic tools no longer work as they once did. This is sophisticated political rhetoric that takes genuine historical wounds and uses them to inoculate the population against external criticism while justifying internal control. The social contract becomes, we, the party, will ensure China is never humiliated again. We restored sovereignty, rebuilt the military, developed the economy, turned China into a power that other nations must respect. In exchange, you accept limits on freedom that would be unacceptable in societies without this trauma. You accept extensive surveillance, restricted speech, political control, because these are necessary to maintain the strength that prevents new humiliation. You accept that Taiwan cannot have independence, that Hong Kong cannot have autonomy, that Xinjiang cannot have self-determination, because any crack in sovereignty might widen into the kind of fragmentation that characterized the warlord era. It's revealing that China's zero-COVID policy, which locked down entire megacities over handfuls of cases long after other countries had moved to living with endemic disease, can be understood partly as a response to loss of control. The virus threatened chaos. Chaos evokes memories of the century when China couldn't control its own territory, when foreign powers and warlords and invading armies did whatever they wished. Therefore, control must be absolute, must be maintained regardless of economic cost or human suffering, because the alternative feels like sliding back toward vulnerability. When that policy was finally abandoned in late 2022 after rare public protests, it was done abruptly, without the preparation that might have eased the transition, perhaps because admitting the policy had been excessive would mean admitting the party had overreacted, which might call into question its judgment on other matters. And yet, to focus only on elite manipulation misses something crucial about how trauma works at the collective level. The trauma is genuine, transmitted through families, embedded in literature and film and public discourse. Surveys conducted by independent researchers consistently show that ordinary Chinese citizens really do feel the century of humiliation shape their nation's trajectory in fundamental ways. They really do see Western criticism through the lens of historical hypocrisy. Nations that profited from Chinese suffering, that imposed unequal treaties, that burned palaces and seized territory, now lecturing China on governance and human rights. They really do support the government's assertive foreign policy, not because they're brainwashed or coerced, but because it aligns with deeply held feelings about national dignity and the determination to never again be vulnerable. Opinion polls show strong public support for territorial claims, for military modernization, for economic nationalism. This is the challenge of collective trauma, separating genuine intergenerational memory from its political weaponization, acknowledging historical victimization while preventing it from justifying contemporary aggression. The global dilemma is how to engage China in ways that neither appease unnecessarily nor provoke counterproductively. Appeasement failed catastrophically in the 1930s when democratic powers tried to satisfy Hitler's demands, only to discover that each concession fed the appetite for more. That history taught the lesson that aggressive powers interpret conciliation as weakness, that accommodation enables further aggression. But containment creates its own risks, particularly when the rising power has legitimate grievances and the capability to resist. Containment risks creating the very conflict it seeks to prevent, turning security dilemmas into self-fulfilling prophecies where each side's defensive preparations convince the other that conflict is inevitable, leading to arms races and crisis escalations that neither side wanted but both feel compelled to pursue. Can the West acknowledge its historical role in Chinese humiliation without appearing weak or inviting demands for reparations? Can China pursue legitimate sovereignty without alarming neighbors who have their own security needs? Is the rules-based international order genuinely universal, or is it simply Western hegemony rebranded, a system created by winners of World War II to preserve their advantages? These aren't rhetorical questions designed to make you think. They're operational challenges that diplomats and policymakers must navigate daily, where mistakes could lead to military conflict between nuclear powers. Economic interdependence was supposed to solve this problem. The theory, developed from European integration after World War II, held that countries deeply enmeshed in trade networks wouldn't risk war because the costs would be catastrophic for all sides. French and German coal and steel integration made war between them materially impossible, which eventually became the European Union, transforming ancient enemies into cooperative partners. But economic interdependence cuts both ways. It creates peace incentives through mutual prosperity, but it also creates coercion opportunities through mutual vulnerability. China's dominance in rare earth element production gives it leverage over high-tech manufacturing globally. Most smartphones, most electric vehicles, most advanced weapons systems require rare earths, and China controls over 80% of processing. Western control of financial messaging systems like SWIFT, through which most international transactions flow, gives it leverage over countries that depend on global finance. Each side has hostages in the other's economy. This could prevent conflict by making it too costly, or it could make conflict more devastating when it comes by adding economic warfare to military dimensions. The Opium Wars ended over 160 years ago, but in the minds of policymakers in Beijing, and increasingly in Washington as competition intensifies, they never ended at all. Every Belt and Road contract negotiated with a developing nation, every Chinese naval patrol in the South China Sea, every American semiconductor export restriction targeting Chinese technology companies, every rising tension in the Taiwan Strait. All of it plays out against the backdrop of that 19th century humiliation and the determination to reverse it. China is methodically addressing every aspect of its historical subordination, regaining lost territory, achieving technological independence, building the navy that can prevent foreign gunboats from ever again dictating terms, accumulating the wealth that prevents economic coercion, establishing the international influence that prevents isolation, creating the industrial base that ensures no adversary can dominate through technology. This creates a world where historical memory drives current policy, where loss aversion operates at civilizational scale, where the fear of returning to vulnerability shapes every major decision. Behavioral economists have demonstrated that losses weigh roughly twice as heavy as equivalent gains in individual decision-making. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels good. At the national level, particularly for nations with trauma histories, the ratio may be even more extreme. China's rise isn't just about gaining power. It's about preventing the loss of power, about ensuring the century of humiliation can never be repeated under any circumstances. This is loss aversion as the foundation of foreign policy, and it makes China simultaneously more cautious and more aggressive than a normal great power. More cautious about genuine threats to sovereignty, more aggressive about anything that might conceivably become such a threat, even if it currently isn't. The West faces its own historical reckoning that it has largely avoided. The prosperity that built Victorian London, that funded the Industrial Revolution's expansion, that established British global dominance for a century. Some significant portion of that came from drug trafficking on an industrial scale. The unequal treaty system wasn't an unfortunate side effect or an aberration. It was deliberate policy, carefully constructed to subordinate China while maintaining the fiction of legal legitimacy. The destruction of the old summer palace wasn't collateral damage or heat of battle excess. It was calculated cultural annihilation designed to break resistance through psychological warfare. You cannot understand modern China without understanding these facts. And you cannot understand the current geopolitical landscape without recognizing that the nations that perpetrated this system are now asking China to follow rules and norms that those same nations violated systematically when it suited their interests. But acknowledging historical guilt doesn't resolve current dilemmas. Admitting that the West brutalized China doesn't tell us whether China's current behavior represents defensive sovereignty protection or offensive expansion, whether its rise represents healing from trauma or the perpetuation of trauma through new victims. The abused sometimes grow determined to refuse further abuse while treating others with dignity. The abused sometimes grow to inflict abuse on others, becoming what they once hated. The abused sometimes do both simultaneously, depending on context and power differentials. Which pattern describes China's trajectory remains contested, will continue to be contested, and may not have a single answer because the reality is probably more complex than any simple pattern. What the Opium Wars teach beyond the specific history of one conflict in one century is that economic exploitation backed by military violence creates wounds that persist across generations, that compound rather than heal, that shape national psychology long after the immediate perpetrators and victims are dead. They teach that technological superiority doesn't confer moral superiority, that steamships and artillery can force market access but can't force genuine partnership or respect. They teach that humiliation is a strategic blunder of the highest order. It creates enemies who never forget, who will spend centuries, if necessary, reversing their defeat, who will transmit their grievances to children and grandchildren until restoration is achieved or the civilization collapses trying. Most importantly, they teach that history doesn't end. It compounds. It accumulates interest like a debt that grows while unpaid. It returns with force multiplied by time and resentment. The silver that flowed from Britain to China before the opium trade has been repaid many times over in the century of suffering that followed. But accounts like this aren't settled through mathematical equivalence. They're settled through power relationships, through the determination of who gets to write the rules for international interaction. China remembers the Opium Wars in ways that shape every major policy decision, every diplomatic stance, every military deployment. The question for this century is what the world will remember of how it responds to China's remembering. Will we recognize historical trauma while preventing it from justifying new traumas? Will we build frameworks that allow genuine sovereignty for all nations without enabling coercion? Will we transcend the cycles of humiliation and revenge that have characterized great power transitions throughout history? Or will we repeat the pattern, creating new wounds that future generations will spend their lives trying to avenge, perpetuating conflicts that could have been avoided through wisdom applied early enough? The answers will determine not just China's future, but the world's. Whether we stumble into a new Cold War or worse, whether we build genuinely multilateral institutions that respect diverse systems while maintaining common standards, whether we learn from history or remain imprisoned by it, these outcomes hang in the balance. And the clock that started ticking in 1839, when Commissioner Lin destroyed those first chests of opium at Human, believing righteousness would triumph over profit, is still ticking now. Every day brings new decisions that either move us toward understanding and accommodation, or toward confrontation and catastrophe. The Opium Wars may have ended in 1860, but their consequences are still unfolding. And we are living through the next chapter right now.